Chapter 27, Exodus to NP1. The snow-terrain vehicles they rode in did not move at amazing or shocking speeds. David drove with Trace in the passenger seat in the lead vehicle. Brick was in the middle. Since he was alone, it made sense to keep eyes on him in the event anything went wrong. Ashley drove her and Dolly in the rear, following up behind the line of vehicles. David realized that since they had been here in the Arctic, the sky had either been a dark gray or, as it was now, dark. He realized that time worked differently up here. He wondered how Ashley was doing as he drove, shaking off drowsiness. She was shaken up badly after Montreal, and it seemed at first like she wanted out of this operation. But she stuck it out. Even now, she was the one driving her vehicle. Given the circumstances, even if her heart wasn't in it anymore, she was still going to be a driving force. David realized that was one of the many things about her that kept him so fascinated by her. She pushed for the end results she wanted. "Oh, shit, man. I guess this is really gonna go down then, huh?" Trace said. It was the first thing either had said since they began the drive over 10 minutes or so ago. "Well, yeah, dude. Did you think at some point I was gonna turn around and say, 'Just kidding, you guys?'" David asked. Trace looked over at him, but David kept his attention on the landscape. There could be sections of ice that were weak and could give way to the weight of the vehicle. "You know what I'm saying, man. I knew it was what we planned or whatever, but I don't know. I thought the DEA was the end of the line. I thought Montreal was definitely the end of the line. I just keep thinking somewhere along we would get snuffed out," Trace said as he sat there picking at his thumbs. "Nah, come on. We had one or two hiccups, but really nobody saw us coming. That's why we have gotten this far, and it's why we will get into that plant. They keep underestimating us," David replied. "No, man. It wasn't that no one saw us coming, or that they underestimated us. It was fucking dumb luck. Really, this team ain't that special. I've seen Nex put together some real hotshot operators and watch them execute a plan perfectly. Then one unlucky thing happens, and it's game over. This ain't been skill. It's been luck," Trace said, as he leaned his face towards a small vent that spit out a drizzle of heat. "What are you trying to say, Trace? Think we have cashed out all our luck or something?" David said. He also nodded at a pack of cigarettes sitting on the small dash. Trace reached over and pulled one out and lit it, then gave it to David. He hated this. Due to being the driver, he couldn't light his own smokes, so Trace had to do it as if David was a child being given a candy by a parent. "I don't know if we cashed out or anything so dramatic, but even you gotta admit, this is the point of no return part of anything. What we plan to do has only been tried once or twice and always ended in a goddamn mess," said Trace. "Yeah, but those were in populated places with the mainland power plants. This one is top secret, far away from everything. You have to admit, all that plays in our favor," David said. "It also plays right against us. No one knows where we are besides the old pilot, who won't be making any extra stops. If we get caught up out here, no one is coming for us," Trace replied. David quickly moved his right hand off the wheel to pull the cigarette out as he blew and flicked the ashes out on the dash. Wasn't like it was his car, so no need to worry about being tidy. It also beats having the ash fall on his coat and shirt. He began to wince in pain as the muscles in his left forearm started to tense up. His phantom limb was acting up again as his body and mind believed he was gripping tight with the missing hand. Trace looked at him while David repositioned in his seat, trying to mask the pain. "Does it really feel like your hand?" Trace asked. "Yeah, it sure fucking does," David said through gritted teeth. He put the cigarette back in his mouth and puffed. It didn't help with the pain so much, though. "That shit's crazy. Does it ever stop? Or do you have to live with it like that forever?" Trace asked. Chops didn't say, just said it's normal, David replied. But now he was wondering himself if this was a pain he would have to live with forever, or the other feelings that sometimes came from this. Like an itch on the backside of his hand, he couldn't scratch because it wasn't really there. Or how he would pick at his thumbs. He still could do that with his right hand, but with the left gone, sometimes the desire to pick at his left thumb would drive him nuts. Would he really have to deal with these things for the rest of his life? The two of them sat in silence again for a moment, as the smoke from David's almost finished cigarette filled the space in the transporter. David took a moment to look out the window and up to the sky. Here, in this part of the world, the night sky was filled with lights from so many stars. He realized that without the lights from cities and human civilizations, The night sky was more alive and vibrant than he had ever seen before. He wondered if Ashley had taken the time to look at it as well, since they had been up here so far removed from the rest of the world. Well, if we do get out of this one, I'm going to take a couple months off, even if Nex really wants me to go on a gig. I'm going to tell him, piss off, I just hacked a goddamn power plant. Then I'm going to go find some tail. Trace said, looking over at David with a sly smile. It's been a minute anyways, even before all this shit started, and I have come to realize I should really take in more the world has to offer, he continued. More of the what the world offers? Who's the girl you are thinking of when you say some tail? David snorted. I don't know. Most likely a fair lady of the night. Unlike you, I don't need to care about the bitch I'm screwing, Trace said. As he said this, he clasped his hands together in an affectionate way. David smiled. I'm glad your definition of more of what the world can offer amounts to some strange, disease-ridden woman on the corner. At least I have an idea as to what and where Ashley has been. David replied. Ah, you two are like high school kids, at least I think. Look, you probably haven't fucked anything else, am I right? Trace asked. No, Trace, you ain't right. Just because I spent the first 29 years of my life doped up on Chembal doesn't mean I never slept with anyone besides her, David replied with some defense in his tone. Trace leaned back in his seat with a yellow-toothed smile. Really, Casanova? How many women fell prey to your wicked chemdog charms in your time then? Said Trace. His voice was filled with glee. He knew he had David cornered on this subject. David quickly glanced over at Trace, then returned his eyes to the path again. He nodded at the cigarettes, and Trace sighed as he reached for them and began to light one. These will kill you someday, you know, Trace said as he handed David the now lit cigarette. 2, David replied as he released a puff of smoke. It took Trace a moment to piece together what David meant, but then let out a laugh. 2? That's all the ass you had before her? Shit, man. No wonder you act like a puppy dog with her, Trace said as David's face began to go warm, flush with embarrassment. Luckily, with the cold, it hid this reaction. He pondered why this was something embarrassing for guys. Generally speaking, in the year 2055, almost nobody in the general population talked about anything sex-related. This was due to the chemical balancing, the miracle of Chembal. With everyone being balanced by the drug and being closely monitored by your primary doctor throughout the year, the average person didn't think about much more than work, eat, sleep, do over the next day. So, with the removal of many social cues similar to this one, David never considered this as something that would make him feel silly or dweebish. Yet, even after spending so much of his life in the modern world where conversations where the subject could be inferred as toxic masculinity had been removed by Chembal, here he was having that exact conversation. And he did feel embarrassed over the number of women he did sleep with. What does it matter, man? How much Chembal have you had to take in your life? David asked, gearing up to try and turn the tables of the conversation. Trace stopped to think for a moment. I don't know. Not much, if any. Once they started threatening re-education at the kid's home, when I was a kid I just left. Why does that matter? Trace said. It matters because you don't really know what it's like to have every part of being a human being stripped down to its near basic function. To have people play with the framework of your mind with drugs, tell you that the problem isn't them, but you, and have all things like sex drive and desire removed or reduced to near nothing. David said he could see Trace's body language change a little in the seat next to him as he spoke. Now, imagine waking up every day, feeling like there is something wrong with all of it. Asking, why do I have to work this shit job? Or, why am I alone? But not being able to really dig much deeper than those fleeting thoughts, because the next round of pills are up, and look at that. They washed away those questions. It washed away those drives. He continued. Yeah, I get it. It's fucked, I know. I was just passing time anyways. Trace said with a level of sympathy and annoyance about the scolding. About 5 more seconds passed, then David looked over quickly at Trace. How many for you then? David asked. Trace looked confused for a moment. Then the lights flicked on. 6, he said. David busted out laughing and Trace's jaw dropped. What's so goddamn funny about 6? He asked. Trace, dude, you have spent most of your life not being hindered by Chembal, and you only have been with 6 chicks? I mean, including Ashley, I'm at 3, and I pulled that off while on Chembal. I say my first 2 count as 2 each, and Ashley counts as 3. So, in effect, that's basically 7. You suck, David declared. They went back and forth on this for some time. It felt good to David. It was just a conversation of two guys talking shit without censoring, without drug-induced nothingness. It was natural. Another 30 or so minutes had passed as the lineup of 3 vehicles moved through the iced-over Arctic landscape. As David continued straight, he thought he noticed something odd just a little bit ahead of them. It was dark, and making heads or tails out of possible openings in the iceland was difficult to start, but it was becoming increasingly more difficult. He leaned forward and squinted his eyes further on ahead, trying to make out what exactly he was seeing. Trace noticed this and looked forward too, clearly unaware of what David saw. "What are we looking at exactly?" Trace asked after a moment. "The ice looks kind of strange up there, but I can't tell for sure why. Maybe it's a hill or something," David said. They were getting closer to what caught his eye, but in the dark it was still hard to see. "Okay, wait a minute," Trace said. "Why the hell are you driving towards a terrain change without knowing what it is first? Stop the damn mover, and how about we go walk closer to make it out, instead of losing our lives or the vehicles?" he continued. David realized Trace was right and slowed down to come to a stop. As he did this, Trace spoke over a secure radio line to the rest of the team. They began to stop as well. Once everyone was stopped, David and Trace exited the vehicle, Brick was slowly getting out of his own, and Ashley and Dolly were already on foot, moving closer to them. "What's the fucking deal?" Brick said in his gravelly voice. There was a certain level of discomfort in it that told David Brick was in pain again from the cold. "Something funny up ahead with the layout of the terrain. Figured we should move closer for a moment on foot to make sure we don't lose the vehicles in a deep ditch, or worse," David said. Brick began to open his vehicle's door. "I'm waiting here. Go do your recon shit," Brick said simply as he got back into the vehicle. The cold must have been playing havoc on his bones. David looked over at Ashley and Dolly, who had now come to be standing beside him and Trace. "You guys think something is wrong up ahead or something?" Ashley asked. "Nash thinks he sees something weird up ahead. It's too dark for me with just one eye. We figured better to look on foot if it really is a problem," Trace said. Dolly looked past David and Trace to try and look out at the terrain. "Well, all right then. Let's make it quick, it's cold as hell out here." The 4 of them turned and began to carefully walk forward. In the night, on snow and ice, one wrong step sent you down on your ass. They walked about 10 feet forward, then Dolly noticed it too. "I see it, I think." But she trailed off on her line of thought, because now they were all close enough to notice it. They were about 15 feet or so away from a massive hole. Maybe a hole wasn't enough to really describe it. A giant, man-made circular valley laid before them. In the middle stood the biggest power plant David had ever laid his eyes on. Giant couldn't quite explain it. It was shaped like nearly all other power plants he had seen. 4 base points that all met on a single pointed top. It was sterile white, and David couldn't imagine how much maintenance it took to remain that pristine looking. As he stood near the edge of this giant hole in the ice looking down at the immense structure, he tried to gauge how massive it actually was. He couldn't even begin to guess. How big is that thing?" he asked, finally cutting through the group's silence. It's kinda hard to tell. Maybe, I don't know, it's gotta be like 600 feet tall, right?" Trace said. But there was uncertainty in his voice. "It's too massive. There's just no way of knowing how deep this freaking hole is or even how big around it is." As Ashley spoke, her voice caught in her throat and she had to force it out. Wait, how are we even supposed to get down there?" Trace asked, snapping out of his shock. "We can't scale this giant hole. Besides not having any kind of climbing shit, we would be sitting ducks on the side of a giant ice wall if someone just looked up from down there." He was right. If they had no other way down, then this whole thing was nothing more than a giant tourist attraction that cost David a literal hand. His eyes zipped back and forth in the giant hole. The power plant was gigantic and took up most of the space in the hole. But there looked like there were a few tiny trailer-like structures way down near the base of the plant. Then he saw it. In the ice, all the way down where the hole bottomed out, was giant double-sided doors. "Look," he pointed out, "right there. Looks like a door for vehicles or transports of some kind. Maybe we can find the opening of those tunnels and use them to come in from the ground level." The other 3 looked where he pointed. You seriously want to try and find the entrance to an ice tunnel and drive towards a door that most likely will be locked, just so we can get down there into the bottom of this huge-ass pit and try to get into this big-ass plant? Trace said. But before David could return with a reply, Dolly spoke up. Shit, sugar, why are you complaining now? We are in the goddamn Arctic looking down at the damn thing, ain't we? Time to say no was a few stops back. She said to Trace, then turned to face David. How do we find the entrance to that tunnel, you think? David looked back down. Well, although I'm willing to bet it's easier now to dig tunnels into ice than it was before, I still wouldn't doubt if the tunnel they made is just a straight line, David said. How can we know that? Ashley asked. Well, for one, the most practical reason, it's quicker typically to go in a straight line to somewhere than it is to add a bunch of extra turns. Secondly, this is a power plant that I assume our federal government controls or at the very least, shares control of. If there's one thing I've learned during my time working for the government, everything is done in a way that anyone can repeat the process, David said. They all took a moment to look back down at the huge pit with the giant power plant structure that rested within. Then they moved back to their vehicles, gave Brick a quick update on the situation and the plan, and then began to move their vehicles to the left as they moved towards the section of the hole where the tunnel's entrance was in the pit. David also popped a crank-up pill. It was game time, and he needed to be able to focus on more than being sleepy and covered in pain. Once they had got to the area that aligned with where the tunnel was, David and Trace stepped out again to try and line it up as well as they could. As David inched closer to the edge of the hole, he began to feel fear creeping in. He realized that his whole body was shaking, and it wasn't from the cold. This hole was so massive that if he fell, he would be dead before he even hit the base of the pit. He turned around cursing. We need Brick, David said. Trace looked at him confused. What's Brick going to do that so differently than we are doing? Him peeking over the edge will be the same if you or I do it, Trace said. Yeah, no shit, but he can hold someone so they can look over and have some protection from taking a free fall. They went over to Brick's vehicle and explained to him the need for him to get out and help with looking over the edge. His black and blood-red eyes stared coldly back at David, but then he got out and began to walk near the edge with them. Trace had run back over to the vehicle they were driving and looked in the cargo section to find some simple rope that could be used to create a tether line in extreme weather conditions. They wrapped it around David's midsection a couple times and tied it as tightly as they could. David began to feel both the effects of the crank-up pills kicking in and the nervous tension of preparing to dangle over the edge of the pit. David patiently waited for Brick to get into a position he felt confident he could hold. Once he gave David the okay sign, David began to slowly edge his feet right up to the border of the giant pit. Once the tips of his shoes were just barely over the edge of the pit, he leaned his torso forward, shakily and slowly as he looked down at the bottom. His heart felt as though it would leap out of his chest at any moment while he stood at what felt like the edge of the world. He looked where the door was and saw they were about 25 feet or so to the right of it. All right, I see it now. I could use a good tug back, please, he said, not being able to mask the fear. Brick gave him a sudden and sharp yank. His feet left the ground, and for a moment, with his body no longer touching any part of the surface, his mind went into panic and assumed he was falling. But within 2 seconds, he fell on his back, having been yanked so hard he was now almost 4 feet away from the edge. He crawled another 4 or 5 feet away before standing up. His legs were shaking from the experience. They got back into the vehicles and adjusted based off David's eyeball guesswork and began to drive in the direction of where they hoped the tunnel's start point could be found. They drove in silence for nearly 40 minutes, and David was beginning to wonder when the sun might come out. He looked down at the small clock in the vehicle. It read 4:27 a.m. He realized the sun would soon be coming out and they would lose cover of night. Shit, he thought to himself. I don't even know if the cover of night has been useful anyways. As they kept going forward, Trace began to grumble about how they weren't going to find shit as they drove, and that this whole thing was beginning to be what he thought it was all along, a bust. But just then, they spotted something. It almost looked like another outpost, only bigger. They stopped before getting too close. You could tell from the lights emitting from the place it still had people there. Maybe it's where the workers and scientists live, David said. Kinda small if our theory of slave labor is the case, though, Trace replied. Maybe they forced them to stay in the plant? David said, We should probably go get the others. The entrance may be somewhere in that place, he continued. They turned their backs on buildings and made their way back to the rest of the team. Once they regrouped, they told the others what they found. So, the plan is to walk into this camp and try to locate a tunnel? Ashley said. After listening to David and Trace, she didn't sound convinced that what they found was the way in. For once, it was Trace who defended the plan. It ain't like we got much else in the way of a damn alternative, he said. Either we sneak in and see what the place is, or we go past it, hoping this wasn't the place. But look at where we are. It's close enough to the plant that it makes sense. After a few more minutes of everyone but Brick putting in their 2 cents, they grabbed the gear, put their cams on their heads, and began to sneak up on the camp. The sun was beginning to rise on the horizon, and soon any cover from the dark they had would be gone. When they got up to the area, they noticed that while there were lights on by doors that lead into the structures, nothing else was moving. They made their way around the backs of the buildings and tried their best to stay hidden. At this point, the effects of the crank-up pills were in full effect, and David was on high alert. As they all got ready to make a dash across the camp to the other side of the buildings, he heard a door handle being opened. He held his right hand up to tell everyone to stop for a moment. Suddenly, 6 figures began to shuffle out of one of the buildings. They all were wearing typical heavy-duty outfits that kept you from getting cold so quickly. They shuffled along the other side of the campsite. David and his team began to sneak behind them on the other side. As they followed the 6 figures as they walked, David tried to listen in on the conversation they were having. It was a bunch of tech-type talk, but the type of tech talk you would almost expect from a tradesman, not scientist. Then the figures got to a building with a garage door, and one of them began to punch in some numbers. David looked at the others and nodded his head. Once that door opened, he planned to rush the figures. Then the sound of the garage door rattled as it opened electronically. Someone in the group laughed at another person's joke. David began to rush towards them. He was hoping his team was following his lead. Within a couple of seconds, David was within range of the group of workers, just as they entered the garage building. With a speed he didn't even realize he possessed, he struck the back of the closest worker's head with his pistol. The sickening, thudding sound of the gun colliding with a human head was followed by the wounded groan someone makes when they have been hit without knowing from where. The other 5 in the party all looked back and saw David, who was joined by his team. He held his gun down at the person he had just pistol-whipped, while Brick, Dolly, Ashley, and Trace all aimed their weapons at the other 5 companions of the incapacitated worker. The shocked workers raised their hands in surrender. Only their wide eyes were visible through their face masks that were worn to protect against the cold. David looked past the van they all were about to enter and saw a paved road that led down to what he assumed was the opening at the bottom of the pit. Then he looked back at the team. That road lead to the power plant? David asked sharply. The person who was poised to take the driver's seat nodded. Even though the layers of weather protection, it was clear the driver was a man. Yes, it does. You shouldn't be here. This is a highly Before the man could continue, David cut him off. Don't feed me some canned, highly secured line of bullshit. You know why we are here in this icy hell. You think we give a shit about highly secured at this point? David spat as he lowered down to put the barrel of his gun right on the temple of the person he had struck moments before. They were beginning to stir, and when he looked down, he saw a middle-aged woman's terrorized and confused face looking at the gun. The man who had spoken earlier spoke up again. Okay, I get it. Let's all calm down. We are just a maintenance team. Besides the fact that what you plan to do is a gigantic mistake, killing any of us is an even bigger one, the man said behind his face guard. Well, how about we make a compromise then? Do what you are told, and you don't have to die. David said, pressing the gun harder against the woman's forehead. Normally, David wouldn't go about things this way, but these people didn't deserve mercy. They were part of the system that literally were sucking energy out of the people of the world, enslaving others to work in these plants, and pushing the terrorist categorization on people like him in propaganda to the population at large. It didn't matter that they were just maintenance. They helped maintain a corrupt system. The man standing at the driver's door nodded slowly. All right, cowboy, all right, whatever you say. Come on, guys, let's do what he says. The man spoke to the rest of the maintenance team calmly. David quickly ordered them all to stand by the side of the wall. Trace turned around and shut the garage door so that no one else could see anything else. Dolly, Trace, and Ashley began to search the 6 maintenance members as David and Brick held them at gunpoint. Kind of strange for there to be only 6 of you for a plant that large, David said. The man who had done all the talking so far spoke up. There's more than just us. We are just the team from this campsite, and we are a morning switchover team. In 30 minutes, the night shift will come up that tunnel. He stated matter of fact. David realized they needed to strategize a game plan to mitigate the risk of this possible encounter. At the same time, Trace, Dolly, and Ashley were finishing their search of the workers, and Trace was bringing the badge of the driver over to David for inspection. David examined it intently, reading the inscription. August Mitchell, Maintenance Team Lead Section A5. So, you are the lead technician then? David asked the man named August. Yeah, I am, August said. So that means you can be plenty helpful then, David said, starting to piece together a plan. Take all their badges. He told Dolly and Trace. They looked at him, then began to understand his plan, and started to remove badges from the team of 6. Luckily for them, this building had multiple functions, one of which was a repair shop to work on the shuttle vans the teams drove to get to the power plant. They quickly found some duct tape and Brick began to nicely wrap up the team. The man named August stood angrily staring at David while his team was being taped and corralled into a storage closet. You goddamn fool, August said to David as Brick approached him for his turn at being restrained. Brick was doing a fantastic job of making them completely immobile and incapable of verbally attracting attention. Even if you get to the plant, what do you think you are going to do once in there? Only thing waiting for you there is something much worse than death, August said. David stepped closer to him as Brick began to wrap tape around August's mouth. Worse than death? What's worse than death is being an unaware pawn or slave for a collection of corrupt and demented autocrats who literally drug us into compliance to mind-numbing work, living hollow, empty lives. Why, just so they can suck us fucking dry. David glared at August, who was now unable to reply. The 2 men stared at each other with matching anger and determination in their eyes. Even when Brick placed August into the closet, August never broke eye contact with David. As the 5 of them jumped into the shuttle to begin their final descent towards the largest power plant in the world, David thought about August Mitchell's stare. Whatever August believed in, he believed in it wholeheartedly. If everyone that David was up against in this fight was going to be like August, he realized just how desperate his quest for enlightenment was really going to be.